Hello, thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott, usually in Oxford, but today in France, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, D.C., to the 47th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please do not use the chat button, but just the Q&A button. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try and put them to the panel to consider in the second part. We urge you to ask your questions as and when they occur to you so that we don't get a bottleneck at the end. So I'm looking forward greatly again to this very important discussion today. Over to you, Sandy.
Thanks very much, Mike. Distinguished indeed, our panel today. Baroness Shami Chakrabarti, who is a labor peer in the House of Lords and a tireless campaigner for human rights around the world. She is the author of On Liberty, I suppose, with apologies to John Stuart Mill, and a number of other works talking about the importance of human rights and human affairs. Ronald Krotoshinsky directs the program in Constitutional Studies and the Initiative for Civic Engagement at the Law School of the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, I believe, in the southern part of the state, one of the people who upholds the banner of free speech and free expression in the southern part of the United States. Adrian Shabazz is from Freedom House, a private nonprofit organization that looks over freedom in the world, publishes a volume every year telling us how the various countries in the world are doing in respecting individual and group freedoms. And he is in charge of reports like the annual on Freedom on the Internet, Nations in Transition, and other new work on transnational repression. Lord William Wallace is the Liberal Democratic spokesman for the Cabinet Office and Constitutional Issues, also in the House of Lords. He joined the Liberal Party as a student a few years ago, fought 5 parliamentary elections, and led the party's manifesto in the 1979 and 97 elections. So he's got a lot of history on this subject. In 1996, he was appointed to the House of Lords as a Liberal Democratic spokesman on foreign affairs and defense. We have a somewhat ironic title today, is democracy a democratic form of government, which is really intended to ask the question, has democracy just become a sort of symbolic word that we all like to describe our systems of government, or do we really, do the various places that call themselves democracy actually follow democratic practices? I'm going to turn first to Adrian Shabazz from Freedom House because he has a sort of catalog and can tell us what the trends are and where things seem to be happening in this domain right now. Adrian?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here with all of you. So Freedom House, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization, and one of the things that we are most known for, as mentioned, is producing freedom in the world. We've been producing this analysis for over 50 years. And what we've generally seen is that over this 50-year period, there was a period of what some have called the third wave of democratization. where you had many authoritarian regimes, many military dictatorships that people believed would never fall. But over in the 70s and particularly in the 80s in places like South America and in Europe and in East Asia democratized. And in contrast to that, and in contrast to some of the enthusiasm around uh, democratization around the world, for the past 18 years, we've actually seen a reversal of that trend. So, specifically, what we have seen is that those countries that are more in the not free category of the countries that we rank are becoming less and less free. So, countries like Russia, countries like China, Iran, and others are essentially cracking down even more on the limited level of freedom that we've seen. That's been the major trend when we've done our data analysis for the past 18 years. And it's been interesting to see where exactly that crackdown has come. When we looked at the 18-year decline, there was one indicator that stood out. We have 21 indicator or 25 indicators that we look at. And the one indicator that has driven the decline in global freedom is a decline in freedom of expression and media freedom, which I think is very appropriate for this convening. So it's been certainly a gloomy trend. You know, there's certainly some pushback. There have been some gains, countries that have risen from not free to partly free and partly free to free. There's also been some backsliding within democracies, as we'll go through, I'm sure. I would say that over the 50-year period, the general trend, which is a positive one, is that once countries receive that status as a free country under our ratings, they tend to stay free. So, you know, despite the level of backsliding that we are seeing in many democracies, it's still rather rare for let's say, a consolidated liberal democracy to slide all the way down into autocracy, particularly those countries that have had a free status for a long time. But that said, you know, we certainly never know, and there are important reasons why we are genuinely seeing democratic backsliding in places like the United States and in Europe and Brazil, other democracies. So that's sort of a global sense of where we are.
Can you cite a couple other examples for us of the backsliding and what you characterize as backsliding? What some of the examples are of the practices turning around?
Of the reversing of the backsliding?
Well,
Or
actually,
of the backsliding itself?
Of the backsliding itself, I'm
Sure
sorry.
thing. Sure thing. So we generally see it starting within restrictions on civil liberties. So, you know, we generally start to see the passage of laws that restrict what journalists are doing, increased obligations on academics, on the private sector as well. So there's a legal component of this where it's almost a gradual heightening of laws and regulations to and essentially to restrict or even criminalize certain parts of civil society. We see that. I think India is a really important example of this, where you have all sorts of laws on foreign contributions, laws on tax, laws on elections, where are on the spreading of so-called false news that are then weaponized against government opponents. So it's essentially using the rule of law to crack down on true democracy, on one's political opponents. And I would say that generally, you know, those crackdowns, with some exceptions, they tend to be through this legal nature where it's more gradual and where it can be harder to spot until it's too late. You know, it's really seldom that we see a wave of arrest. There are certainly countries that are more on the partly free spectrum, where I'm thinking of a Nicaragua or even places like, well, some of the more less free countries as well within South America, where you start to see a large crackdown on civil society. You see political prisoners being imprisoned, places like Tunisia, in Venezuela, in Thailand as well, where we're starting to see more and more imprisonments of the political opposition. So there is this legal nature to it, and I think this gets back to the title of today's discussion, which is that it's no longer the time where there's this, in some ways, where there's a clear distinction between, half of the world is dictatorships and others are democracies. You have nearly every country around the world that claims to be a democracy. The Russia, China claim to be democracies. You have the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea. So from an international norms perspective, many authoritarian leaders have become quite savvy of using the language of democracy, using the language of human rights to legitimize themselves both internationally and within their own people, and then using the instruments of democracy, like a court or the passage of laws, in a way that is totally against the principles of democracy, right? So they're going against their own opposition, those particular ethnic and religious groups, who they sell as enemies of the people in order to justify their own power. So it's generally, I would just say that it tends to be this gradual process. Gradual is not to say that it doesn't have an impact on people. It actually has a devastating impact on people's freedom. And it tends to be where once we see that crackdown on civil liberties, then there is then we see the declines in political rights. So it's once the elected government, who may have even been freely elected, they essentially use all of their power to then pull up the rope so that nobody can contest them in power.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Shami, from your perch in the House of Lords and your long experience with these matters, how would you characterize what's been happening?
So thank you, Sandy. And once more, it's wonderful to be here with such interesting and interested people. I recognize so much in what I heard from Adrian's worldview. A few months ago read Alpa Shah's work on India. Alpa Shah, I think she's been a professor at the LSE for some time. She's, I think, about to move to Oxford. She wrote a book about India called The Incarcerations, about, anybody who annoyed Mr. Modi, whether a lawyer or a trade unionist or journalist, finding themselves literally locked up, in some cases indefinitely. And that's in India that, the parents that my parents came from, that considers itself, this wonderful populous democracy. And we see similar trends all over the place. And frankly, there's been backsliding in the UK. I can say this and you can't. There was some backsliding under Mr. Trump's presidency, including things like not recognizing results of free elections and urging your people to mount insurrection in the face of election results. This is not the sort of thing that I ever thought I would see in these great democracies. And the United States is a great democracy that is looked to all over the world, no question. So we all watch with bated breath what happens there. The one issue I would take with Adrian is when he talked about, I think he used the phrase using the rule of law to crack down on liberties. And I don't think it's the rule of law that is being used. It might be the law that's being used, but that's not the rule of law as we see it. So I'm very much, people have many debates about the rule of law. Let's just say we can't have democracy without first having the rule of law. You can't have really civilization without the rule of law, let alone democracy. The rule of law does require a respect for institutions. The rule of law does require equal treatment for everybody under the law, including the president, the prime minister, wealthy people, and so on. So I think what we've seen is not the rule of law. We've seen the rule of law disrespected and legislation sometimes enacted for the purposes of cracking down on fundamental rights and freedoms. I certainly agree with that. The one thing I would add to the mix and to Adrian's excellent analysis is that I don't think it's a coincidence that this current phase of backsliding coincides with some of the most incredible inequality and wealth that we have ever seen in human history. And I think the new imperium is not the British Empire or the American Empire or even the China. The new imperium is an imperium of billionaires who are so wealthy that they are wealthier than countries. They can buy and sell politicians. They can influence elections. They can incite riots. They can sit in California, as we saw this summer, and incite riots in the north of England and in Northern Ireland. And one of the problems that we have a quarter of the way into the 21st century is that, we thought we had universal suffrage, we thought we had the rule of law, we thought we had democracy, but are we equipped for this new challenge of massive corporations, incredibly wealthy individuals? You could argue that, their shareholders have suffrage, but do the people working in an Amazon warehouse or receiving orders and directions and threats from Elon Musk, where is the democracy in that? And are we capable of protecting any semblance of democracy if we can't, as an international community, start holding these massive corporations and the billionaire bros who own them, holding those corporations to account?
Thank you, Shami. William Wallace, are you surprised by these developments after your long career, after your work on the metaphorical, if not physical, barricades of democracy?
No, I'm not at all surprised. I thought the euphoria when the Soviet Union collapsed was overdone, particularly in the United States. And I spent some time trying to help some of these former socialist countries develop democratic institutions. And as they discovered how difficult it was, you have to have a decentralized market economy, and you have to have the rule of law, which takes some time to establish because it's a matter of culture as much as anything else. And the problems of how to establish a well-regulated market economy, which is what a democracy needs, come up against capitalists and financiers who want to make sure that they get the money. So I agree strongly with Shami that the economic dimension of democracy is a very important one. I remember well Danny Roderick, Turkish economist now at Harvard, saying that you can have two of three fundamental things: democracy, national sovereignty, and global economic integration. And global economic integration, which concentrates wealth in a number of limited hands, is a real problem for democracy, which has to be nationally based. And when you see governments beginning to bend regulation to favor people they want to give contracts to, as we've seen in my country, in Britain, during the COVID pandemic, you are beginning to weaken democracy. That's a huge problem when the rapid spread of technology, for example, does concentrate power in a small number of mainly US-based corporations, and these have adverse effects in countries all over the rest of the world, and people feel disempowered.
Ron Krodashinsky, you are in Alabama, and it's a stronghold of former President Trump and the new image of the Republican Party. And I just wonder what you can say about your neighbors there, about, do they feel that they are strengthening democracy? Do they see themselves as fighters for democracy?
Well, I think many devotees of MAGA view themselves as supremely committed to democracy and democratic self-government. And the Republican Party in Alabama, which is MAGA dominated, achieves 60-70% results. I think this goes to a bigger question that we haven't really addressed as to whether democracy itself is a desirable, at least unfiltered, uncut democracy is a desirable form of government. And I'll lean in on a fairly famous Brit who's no longer with us, a couple actually, Ronald Dworkin, who wrote lucidly and repeatedly about the idea that democracy without any guardrails is not a particularly attractive form of government. Certain decisions, like whether you worship, who you worship, what you do in private, what you read, what you don't read, all of these sort of fundamental decisions that are constitutive of human identity have to be made freely by the individual and without the coercive power of the government. The fact that a majority of people believe that everyone should be Southern Baptist or no one should be gay is entirely beside the point in terms of creating a fundamentally justly ordered society. So there's that. And I want to go also to something that Baroness Chakrabarti said about rule of law. I've recently published a book with Oxford, mandatory plug, Free Speech as Civic Structure. And what I found across democratic self-government is that as between a text, a parchment tiger, to use Madison's turn of phrase, and independent courts, ideally vested with the power of judicial review, if you want democracy and free speech is integral to democracy, you need independent courts, ideally vested with the power of judicial review. And in fact, in the UK, Anthony Lester along with Ronald Dworkin, made this argument over and over. And these incremental reforms, like the Human Rights Act '98, got adopted, but the judges still don't have a full power of judicial review. That said, British courts are excellent. They're staffed with very thoughtful, careful, and independent jurists. And we can see why the courts are so essential, right? Politicians, as two of our panelists have noted, are self-interested. When they regulate elections and electoral speech, they're going to do so to make their re-election easier, not harder. So, for example, malapportionment. If you wait for a malapportioned legislator to reapportion itself, it's going to be like waiting for Godot. In fact, the Supreme Court of Japan, which has invalidated legislation fewer than 10 times since 1947 in democratic government in Japan, has done so to get rid of malapportionment. Why? Because if you don't get rid of malapportionment, it's never going to be fixed. And it's fundamentally unjust for one voter to have 10 or 20 or 1,000 times the voting strength of another voter. And you look at places like Russia, which had an independent court, which Putin systematically destroyed, and places like Hungary and Poland. I mean, Donald Tusk now is trying to figure out how to fix the Polish courts after Law and Justice has systematically tried to politicize them. But if you want free speech, if you want democracy, you have to have an umpire that checks the worst impulses of the incumbent legislators. And the UK has that. When I fly to London, I don't worry about being thrown in a gulag. The judges are there. And even before the Human Rights Act, they were protecting speech, both the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords and the Court of Appeal. I do think judicial review would be formal judicial review, a nice add-on. But a lot of these countries, the first thing the would-be authoritarian does is destroys the independence of the courts. And if you want to figure out whether free speech is protected, you're far more likely to find it in a country that has independent courts than in one that has a free speech guarantee and a written constitution.
When Adrian was going over his sort of list before, he mentioned Nicaragua, which strikes me. I'm old enough to remember in the 70s, the struggle for freedom in Nicaragua. The dictators of decades and decades were being overthrown by the so-called Sandinistas, named for the Sandino, the great rebel of Nicaraguan history. And the people who came to power, it was quite a lot of controversy over this in the United States. People took sides. The Reagan administration tried to shore up the so-called Contras who were opposing the revolution there. Well, the revolution in Nicaragua turned out to be a revolution right back to the times of Somoza. After all was said and done, the repression in Nicaragua today is probably as severe as it has ever been. And there's one man, Daniel Ortega, who calls all the shots. And so I think for at least people of my generation, this must be particularly demoralizing, having stood up, having declared oneself in various places to be on the side of the people, on the side of popular democracy, only to have the popular Democrats turn into autocrats who seem more efficient at it than anyone before. So why should people not be discouraged? Shami, we might come back to you on this. Why is it not discouraging to see something like that happen in a
It's
relatively
incredibly
short time?
discouraging. Look, I'm occasionally discouraged myself. A shameless plug for my own book, which is recently out, called Human Rights: The Case for the Defence. What a thing to have to write in the UK. What a book to have to, why did Penguin commission me to write a book called Human Rights: The Case for the Defence, a quarter of the way into the 21st century in our so-called mature democracy? Because rights, freedoms, even our courts have been trashed in popular media and political discourse in the United Kingdom in recent years. I am nostalgic for Reagan and Thatcher. I'm a woman of the Democratic left. I am nostalgic for Reagan and for Thatcher compared with what we've seen in the Conservative Party, the Republican Party in the US, and the British Conservative Party in recent years. Why? Because there was some respect for the rule of law as the rules of the game of democracy, the guardrails, as Ronald called them. The one issue I would take with Ronald, by the way, is when he said we don't have judicial review in the UK. We have a very developed system of judicial review. We just don't have strike down powers for primary legislation. We don't have that nuclear weapon for our Supreme Court. And the argument was always made, if you give the Supreme Court strike down powers, as in the United States, you politicize that court. That was the kind of argument. And we don't have a written constitution here. We don't have an entrenched Bill of Rights. We took many of us took the view for years that was okay. We had a nice evolved gentleman's agreement of a constitution. I used to take that view. I'm not sure I take it anymore, because I think the problem with a gentleman's agreement is, what is the agreement when the gentlemen have all left the room? And the sort of assault on rights and freedoms, and even the judiciary and lawyers that I've seen in recent years in the UK, forget other scary places, has been really quite something. So you're right. The threats to what I think of as democracy, which has the rule of law and fundamental rights and freedoms at its heart, the threats can come from left and right. We use this word populism a lot. We throw it around. We call people hard left and far right. What do we mean by that? For me, the definition of somebody who is a threat to is a populist threat to democracy is someone who does not believe in those institutions, does not believe in the rules of the game, does not take that bipartisan approach that the great Ronald Dworkin, I think of him as American, by the way, but the great Ronald Dworkin wrote about in all his work. But that lovely 2008 book, Is Democracy Possible Here?, that he wrote for a political lay audience, suggesting that Republicans and Democrats could agree around certain fundamental values. That settlement seems to be under threat from left and right at different times all over the world. But there are still some of us flying the flag and still trying to believe and advocate for those values even today.
William, let's ask you to take up Dworkin's question. Is true democracy possible in this world we're living in right now?
Well, we can all argue about what true democracy is. There's a clear distinction between liberal democracy and popular democracy. If you take the Federalist Papers, which were written to justify the US Constitution as an example, they talk about democracy as a process and as one in which you need to go through various hoops before decisions are imposed, because allowing popular enthusiasm or popular emotion to sweep away reasoned discussion of what the consequences of taking a major decision will be can be a huge mistake, as the United Kingdom made over leaving the European Union, for example. A perfect example of a wonderful populist argument sweeping aside all of the evidence about what it might mean for the economy and for future freedom of movement and everything else. So democracy is a very difficult thing to establish and maintain. You need to have the rule of law, as we've all said. You need to have a pretty good distribution of wealth and of taxation. And the idea that each citizen is equal in democracy has also to be sustained by making sure that they are not too unequal economically and socially. And there are plenty of people in any country whose interests are in gaining undue concentrations of power, social prestige, and wealth. So working to hold up to democratic standards and democratic culture is a constant thing we have to work on, otherwise it slips away.
Ron, are you optimistic?
Oh, God, no. And in fact, one other condition I would add for a functioning democracy where voters use the electoral process in a meaningful way to hold government accountable and implement policy preferences is education, right? And we're talking really about, I think, two separate things. And I can't speak to the UK, but here in the US, constitutional literacy is abysmal. People don't know what the Senate is, what the Supreme Court does. When Donald Trump says, if the president does it, it's legal, they don't have the ability to assess the validity of that claim under the terms of the Constitution. So when you have voters who don't understand the institutions of government or the doctrines they animate it, like federalism and separation of powers, it's hard to see how they're going to make prudent choices. We also don't have media literacy. So J.D. Vance and Donald Trump have been saying that Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, have been stealing and using as food local pets, cats and dogs, geese and ducks in the local parks. Blatant lie. Everyone in Springfield, Illinois said it's false. J.D. Vance continues to perpetrate this lie, this libel on this community. And yet, polling data from reputable companies shows that 52% of Republican voters in the United States believe these immigrants are stealing Fluffy the cat and Spot the dog and making them into barbecue. We had Comet Ping Pong in 2016 with Hillary Clinton being accused of running children in a trafficked way in a brothel in the basement of this pizza. A guy from North Carolina went to liberate the kids and shot the place up. So we have just an ocean of disinformation and misinformation. We have Elon Musk perpetrating it with deep fakes of Kamala Harris in a Communist Party outfit. And so we have these media moguls in the US who, under the First Amendment, appear to be able to permit or censor whatever they wish. I don't know why Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg is to be preferred to Joe Biden or Merrick Garland. Censorship is censorship, and we need to think more carefully about the processes of democracy and the marketplace of political ideas. But we have so many problems with both the ability of people to receive and assess the validity of information, and therefore the ability to cast well-informed, rational votes. And I would point to Finland as a country that's actually done a really good job with at least media literacy, which they put great emphasis on. But to go to the points made by Lord Wallace and Baroness Chakrabarti, Finland has very little wealth inequality. It's a very wealthy place. They have high levels of education. And so they have the social conditions necessary to create citizens who are capable of self-government. Jefferson said, if you expected people to be successfully self-governing in a state of ignorance, you want something that has never been and will never be across the entire history of humanity. Ditto Dewey, ditto Alexander Meiklejohn. So I don't know what the other panelists think about how to fix the process of democratic deliberation. But here in the United States, the word that comes to mind is an R word beginning with F. I'm deeply pessimistic about our election. We have voters in a state of ignorance, complete ignorance.
You're breaking my heart, Professor. You are breaking my heart, because from this side of the pond, we watch American movies, everyone's taking the fifth, and one has this sense that surely kids growing up in American schools at least can recite their Bill of Rights. But you're painting a much more depressing picture. But of course, I think it was William who said earlier that We have the tension between, globalization of the economy and democracy, which must be national. Well, yes, of course, as national democracies are very important as a unit of self-determination and self-governance. But international treaties and international human rights conventions in particular are supposed to help create a rule of law for the world, for the world, and help us prevent wars and all the rest of it. I do think that we need some new treaties in addition to our post-war settlement governing things like the internet. I don't think we're as developed as we need to be in relation to holding these tech emperors to account, and then we're squabbling over taking back control and Brexit and this, that, and the other, even squabbling about elections when actually people are governed by whoever they're governed by, Apple, Google, the social media platform formerly known as Twitter. People are living in this new continent. I think of the internet as a new continent, but it is largely ungoverned. There are no sheriffs on that new continent, let alone formally developed democratic and legal systems.
Adrian,
one of the aspects of democracy, if I may just add, one of the things which commends democracy at the minimum is that it has term limits. Elections come and you can throw the rascals out and have someone else in. And what we've seen in the last two election cycles in the United States is that that's been challenged, first by the January the 6th riot in Washington and Trump's refusal to recognize the election result. And this time, as it seemed to start with, that we had two men roughly my age, and I'm very glad I'm not going to be standing for office in the near future, who were refusing to step down and not offering a really wide choice. Thank goodness that's changed a little. But democracy does also require that those in power recognize when the time comes, they should step out of power.
Adrian, you set out a dog's breakfast for us earlier that's been picked over now. I wonder, first of all, what some of your reactions are to what you've heard, but also, are there some places that make you optimistic? Ron mentioned Finland. Are there some other places that give you hope?
Yes, thank you. Well, I would say, let me start by saying I align myself with much of what the fellow panelists have said. I think they've all made some really great points here. I wanted to touch on the broader link between globalization and the backlash against globalization and where we are now, and bringing it back to democracy. So the Baroness was right to point out that the 18 years of decline coincides with the sort of apex of economic globalization. It also coincides with the entry of China into the World Trade Organization, as well as the rise of the internet. And I do think that these trends are somehow linked. And what I would say is that right now, it's a very interesting time to be talking about global democracy, whether that's about the state of democracy within countries or at the international level, through human rights treaties and the work of the UN, because we're going in a totally different direction. And I think what's interesting, if I might just outline what I think that direction is, I don't think we have to go that way, but it's what is the resurgent theme in a lot of countries right now is the backlash against globalization. And there are good things that come with it, and there are bad things that come with it. I myself am a child of globalization. I mean, my parents are from very different backgrounds, Afghan and Italian. They met in France. I was born in the United States. I've been able to, live in many different countries and work in many different places. So I'm, in some ways I'm benefited tremendously from the opening of the world, right? And the opportunities that has provided from people, including people from lower economic backgrounds or from countries that are outside of the sort of core. What's interesting to see is that there is this backlash against the economic aspects of globalization. And I firmly believe that we do have to be holding power to account. That is a fundamental part of how we ensure self-governance, is to make sure that there is no such big centralization of power. That's also the idea behind the separation of power within government. And I think it's time that we extend that also to the private sector. And that's where the work of anti-monopoly practices and competition policy is particularly important. I think it's driven by that same idea, that same value. But what we are seeing is this backlash against the other. It's essentially a backlash against pluralism. And I think that is particularly dangerous. You see this in the United States. You see it in places like India, throughout Europe with the rise of the far right. There is a sort of ethnic nationalism that is coming about, and the supremacy of one people over another. And these anti-globalization ideas are channeled into that, to say that we as a people need to take back power. And it's either taking back power from billionaires, or it's taking back power from these international bodies, whether that's Brussels or the United Nations or the WTO, or it's taking back power from immigrants, essentially, or these others within the LGBTQ community. There are all of these conspiracies about all of these actors working in unison with one another somehow to reject the power of the majority. And I think, and it's really interesting to see, starting with somebody like Viktor Orban in Hungary, but also Modi in India, Donald Trump in the United States, is they're using this similar narrative. And it's something that is picked up by Vladimir Putin in Russia and used to connect with right-wing audiences around the world, is this backlash against all of these different people, as well as the economic policies that have come about that. And that's where they're trying to shift the idea of democracy away from liberal democracy, the idea of balancing majoritarian rights with minority rights. And instead it's full-on majoritarianism, right? It's the people need to regain power and sovereignty. And I find that ideology quite dangerous, because it assumes a level of violence against the other. It assumes a level of violence against institutions, right? And we saw that with January 6th and with election denialism, where the populism comes from almost this myth that this national leader reflects the will of the people. And if you question that, you are against the will of the people. You are against even democracy, some would say, right?
I think you're right, Adrian. You're so right. We had this with Boris Johnson shutting down Parliament. He shut down Parliament in 2019 because it was annoying him, because it was frustrating his Brexit arrangements. And he shut them, and the justification he gave was the one you just cited, the will of the people. So you have this charismatic hard man leader, whoever it is, and they've got a direct line to the will of the people. The irony is, of course, they're usually quite wealthy. They're supposedly ethnic nationalists, but they're all in cahoots with each other. They're all literally talking to each other. They're very international in the way that they work, actually. Right. And they're selling this bill of goods to the people and saying, I've got the will, I've got the will of the people. It is, it's not new. I mean, there are similarities with the 1930s. It has to be said. Except, we've got even greater challenges with the technology and so on, as you described. But I think we just have to, the liberals, if you like, the constitutionalists, the rights people have to find ways to cooperate and to respond.
But if I may add just one democracy is broken. Voters in the U.S. are in echo chambers. They're on social media in groups that sort by ideology. So if you're in MAGA, you're not listening to Hillary Clinton or Tim Walz or Kamala Harris. You're listening to Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity. So, and social media makes money. We know this from the Facebook whistleblower, by keeping people angry and riled. Yeah. So people exist in echo chambers where everyone is saying the same thing, and they're siloed, so that the kind of deliberation and engagement, which is really critical, Alexander Micheljohn makes this point very clearly, that is essential to a functioning democracy that produces decent government, simply can't exist. And the profit motive of these corporations, Facebook, X, YouTube, TikTok, is to encourage anger and balkanization, not dialogue and engagement. So if all of us were talking about how to make the government better, I think we could probably work it out. We might have some differences, but we would talk to each other. People in the US don't engage. They're in tribes, and the degree of polarization is off the charts. And also this polarization benefits Donald Trump, as does ignorance. So that if you have a political party that gains electoral advantage through balkanization, polarization, ignorance, they have no incentive, right, to make voters more capable of finer and more factually accurate judgments about the way the world is. Trump has been saying, for example, that foreign countries pay tariffs. Most Republicans believe this. They don't accept that the tariff is passed on by the seller of the good or service to the consumer. So how do he says China is going to pay the tariffs. And most Republican voters believe this. How do we operate democracy in a marketplace of political ideas that's full of sewage? I don't have an easy solution. Education, but there's no interest in educating people by those who benefit from ignorance. I'm sorry I have to be the fly in the ointment, but I'm deeply pessimistic about.
I'd just like to throw in that freedom of the press is one of the most difficult things we all have to cope with in democracies now, because we want a free and diverse media, but what we have are profit-driven media and the new very powerful tech companies, which have interests in biasing what you hear. We in Britain are watching the Nevada court case on the future of the Murdoch family holdings, and therefore the future of News Corporation and the ownership of some important newspapers and broadcasting companies in the UK as well. So how we make sure that what your average half-interested voter learns about what's happening in politics and what the major issues and difficulties are, does require us to regulate the press and the media much more tightly than we've done in a number of countries until recently.
Well put. I'm going to interrupt the dialogue right now to say that it's about time to go back to Mike Scott and talk about the questions that have come in. There is room for more questions in the Q&A button if anyone else has something they'd like to submit right now. But Mike, we'll ask you to take over with what you've already got to work with.
Thanks very much. Can I just say thank you to the four of you for just such an amazing discussion that we're having at the moment. There's a question in from Tony Eade. He says, there has been no mention, I think, of the importance of local democracy government. I think, Ronald, you mentioned something about it recently, but he says there's been no mention, I think, of the importance of local democracy government, which has been hollowed out in the UK, despite some success, arguably, with introducing regional mayors. Do panelists think that the centralization of power within democracies has been a significant factor in the widespread loss of belief in the importance of democracy? I mean, it turns to the UK first, so perhaps Shami, I can go to you.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that questioner makes. I think you get cynicism from the cynicism about democracy comes from a sense that it's not delivering, and false expectations. So one of the things we've seen in Britain, I think, is we've seen austerity. We've seen extreme austerity in the last 14 years in relation to public spending, and a sort of blaming of local government. We've seen a gathering of economic and political power in Westminster in central government, and a blaming of local government for not delivering the services including in particular social care for older people, which is a huge challenge that's not been really gripped by anybody yet in the UK. And it's very easy for central government controls the purse strings and then blames local government for not delivering the services.
Yeah.
And that is a recipe for enormous cynicism about politics on behalf of the citizens. You also have corruption. You also have local government corruption. Let's be clear about that. And contracts, construction contracts, and planning decisions, for your mates. That happens. People can see that happening in their communities and before their eyes. So a combination of that false expectation and the expectations being trashed, and corruption at local level is yes, it's another layer of disappointment that breeds cynicism.
But Shami, doesn't that reflect what's been going on at the top as well? I know we've had.
Yeah.
But if you've got blatant wrongs going on in government, deceptions of people giving huge, unbelievable contracts to their mates, of course that becomes a norm within society, doesn't it? That becomes a norm at the local level, and the society itself, it starts to crumble. The rot at the top. Fortunately, we got rid of that.
Absolutely. I mean, look, we talked a lot. We using noble language about the rule of law and so on. But at the most basic level, it's supposed to be one rule for everybody. And when you can see before your eyes day after day that is not the case, whether it's parties in number 10 Downing Street during lockdowns when you can't go to see your dying parents in the old folks home, or whether it's people giving contracts to their mates, or whatever it is, it breeds enormous cynicism and disillusionment in democracy.
And it's also that the world economy has become so much less linked to localities. 50 to 100 years ago, if you worked in a town, the person who employed you was highly likely to live within the same town. You might hate your employer, but you knew him. Now we see in Western Pennsylvania, that they're arguing over whether or not the steel industry should be kept going by the Japanese. And the remoteness of life when you've lost your job and your employer's factory has closed, and the decision is being taken by someone in another country in a way that you don't understand, mainly on financial grounds, is part of what's feeding discontent with very rapid economic and social change. And the sense of disempowerment is very strong, and that certainly feeds populism. So how we cope with the very rapid economic change we're going through, the challenge of climate change, which also poses all sorts of threats that people see immediately, and the political response to that and the economic measures which that requires the states to take in are all extraordinarily complicated and not easy to explain even to educated publics.
I do think in the US, though, that to the extent democracy functions, it functions best at the local level. I'm coming to you from Stanton, Virginia, where I have a home, and the city council here is readily accessible to the people. You see the people running the city in the park, at the grocery store, at the PTA meeting, and you can't help but interact with your neighbors. And since you're living with each other and you know each other, there's a natural tendency not to be an ass. Right? So that there's a level of engagement, positive engagement, dialogue, compromise that exists at the local level that doesn't seem to exist to the same degree, certainly at the state or federal level. In fact, we now have about 800,000 constituents per House member. And, if you're in California, you're one constituent of 33 million of a senator. Most Americans have never met their member of Congress or their senator and will never interact with him, her, or they, much less a president or vice president. They do meet their mayor, their city councilman, their district attorney. And so I do think and believe quite strongly that if people actually engage with each other in real time, even if they fundamentally disagree, it is possible to forge compromises and to achieve common goals and objectives. And to me, that's the problem at the state and federal level. We don't have that engagement anymore between people who fundamentally disagree. Local government, I think, in the United States, most places works pretty well and enjoys high levels of confidence relative to the national government. I do hear what you're saying about funding, though. I've even read here in the U.S. about the problems in Birmingham, or I suppose I should say Brum, not Alabama, but England. And it's terrible, right? Because the Birmingham government or Brum government is being charged with turning, lead into gold or getting blood out of stones. How do you provide these social services and avoid bankruptcy when the purse strings are in Westminster and you lack meaningful home rule powers with respect to taxation? It's a huge problem. You have power without you have accountability without power.
And this is maybe where your constitution helps you. Maybe this is where constitutionalism and the American model is helpful, because there's a little bit
federalism
more
and meaningful home rule in most states where cities are largely independent of their state governments. For example, in Alabama, most cities have policies against discrimination that are comprehensive and include gender status and sexual orientation. Our state legislature would probably never pass such a law, but in Birmingham, it's illegal to deny housing or employment based on sexual orientation or gender status. Why does Birmingham get to do that? The state constitution and state law guarantees a modicum, more than a modicum, of home rule to municipalities, and they are responsive to the needs, wants, and desires of their constituents. People in Birmingham, Alabama don't want employers discriminating, simply put.
I spent 3 years of my life living in Ithaca, New York, and I have great joy dealing with a very, very local government. The problem is that in the world we now live in, you need high-level governance to sort out a large number of problems, and you actually also need, as you're discovering in the United States, the transfer of funds from the richer areas of the country to the poorer, and indeed from richer countries to poorer countries. So we have, for example, a new prime minister in Britain who's been in power for 4 months at most, Shami, who had spent a great deal of his time since he became prime minister out of the country in international meetings, and currently he's in New York at the UN General Assembly. I don't think he wanted to do that at all. When you're the head of a government in a large or small country, you find on your desk a large number of problems that can't be dealt with purely at the national level, and you have to go and negotiate them internationally. That's very hard to explain to the average elderly voter sitting in Birmingham, Alabama, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and if in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, fed up that he's lost his job.
Agreed.
Mike, if I may interject one thing quickly, I think Ron has had an idealistic experience in this small town in Virginia where he has a home where there are many cultural and educational institutions to support this sort of civic health. But the scene across small towns in other states around America is quite grim in some cases. There's been a sort of depopulation of small towns, a terrible, almost undescribed, unwitnessed drug problem in some small towns, and the influence of these communities on life in America is in many respects diminishing, I'm afraid.
That's a fair point, Stanton.
So now you're raining on Ronald's Ronald was, depressed earlier. He comes with a bit of sunshine and you rain on it.
Oh, so sorry.
Yes.
Let's just turn this.
But again, I think Sandy's point goes back to education and civic awareness, civic literacy. He's right. Stanton has a Shakespeare Festival, the American Shakespeare Theater. It has the Heifetz Music Festival. The main employer is Mary Baldwin College. It's a town of about 30,000, whose main industries, if you want to call them that, are educational and cultural. And that draws a different kind of community. And I hadn't thought about that, but I think that's exactly right. But I think it just proves the point, at least, or provides a datum point for the idea that for democracy to work, you need well-educated, engaged citizens. And so I think the challenge is whether national and international organizations will make efforts not only in places like the UK and the United States, but in the global South, in places like South Africa, where the EFF is a populist challenge to the ANC, and advocates a lot of programs that I think would be deeply problematic economically for South Africa, or the nationalism we see under Modi in India. It's not just, the US and the UK are actually in pretty good shape, relatively speaking. If we're talking about democracy globally, my God, I mean, the problem is astonishing, and its scale is breathtaking. And I don't really see any concerted effort. And maybe I'm, perhaps Adrian can educate me. But if there are transnational efforts to increase civic literacy and just literacy in the global South, in democratic polities, who's doing the work and how is it going?
One of the great questions is what all these Chinese who've gone abroad for their education will make of it when they're back in China, and how much the impact of a liberal education will change future developments in China. I think there are many questions about whether or not the current Chinese model is sustainable, but the gamble of sending so many abroad for education, I've taught one or two, and I've spent a great deal of time persuading them that they do better by disagreeing with their professor on occasions than by always parroting back to him what he's just said. That is part of what a liberal education is about, which is why dictatorships so often, and populist movements as well, attack liberal education.
Which is one of the reasons why, even though it's wonderful that everyone is learning STEM subjects and studying science and technology, and I really admire that, particularly seeing young women go into these subjects, the attacks on the humanities and on the arts that we've and education in those areas that we've seen in the UK, I think are very troubling. Very troubling indeed.
What did the EU do, if anything, about Orban shutting down Central European University? That was clearly an attack on academic freedom. The university was globally recognized for its excellence, and it was run out of Hungary. What did the EU, what did Brussels do in response to CEU being driven out of Hungary by local law? Anything? I mean, there has to be some consequence, right, to anti-democratic behavior?
I think that's a very, very fair. I think that's a very, very fair charge to lay at the EU's door, actually. That it's not, the tests for membership and continued membership are not supposed to be purely economic. There is supposed to be a freedom element, a human rights element too, and I think that's a fair charge, actually. I really
think
do.
That gets back to this idea of economic globalization and democracy. And so where we are right now is there's been a flattening of and almost an amoral view to trade, where it doesn't matter who you're trading with, it doesn't matter who we're integrating ourselves with economically, it will be a net positive for all. And I mean, certainly when you look at the influence within China, the billion of people who've been brought out of poverty and continue to be, I mean, there's benefits to it. But what we're now seeing is this backlash, and whether that's the backlash against the role that China plays around the world and in the global South, whether it's the backlash of Hungary within the European Union. We're in this moment now where we've seen that our connectivity to authoritarian countries or countries that are undergoing significant backsliding is actually making us quite vulnerable. And we don't necessarily have the tools, or we're in the process of building the tools for pushing back. And I think it's a really interesting question, and it gets back to something, thinking about the United Nations and even the internet. I would just, something really niche here. There's currently a treaty that is being negotiated on cybercrime. It's a UN treaty on cybercrime, which is a really large, oftentimes legitimate issue, right? But it's a treaty that has been driven by Russian diplomats from the very beginning. And essentially, they've been using this treaty to impart their own norms on what type of behavior can be considered a crime, and then banding together with other authoritarian governments to see this pass through the General Assembly within the coming weeks. And the US is currently deliberating whether, the US should be signing on to this. And it's a treaty that, it's international cooperation, but when it's international cooperation that is driven by bad actors, or let's say like bad faith actors, it actually results in lessening freedom and increasing vulnerabilities within democracies too. So this treaty would allow for then Russia, for example, to request information about people that have committed cyber crimes or any sort of crimes within Russia. And you can think about all of the things that are criminalized within Russia. And through the United Nations, through this treaty, it will allow them to request from other governments, whether that's China or France, to receive information that might be stored on data servers located in those countries about any particular person who they want to go after. So it's really interesting that our connectivity, our cooperation is actually used against ourselves and against our values. And I think that's where there is an interesting pushback that is starting to develop. I think that it's so important that pushback against the harms of globalization or connectivity is balanced, and that it doesn't actually, in many cases, I think it's through more democracy, it's through more transparency, more openness, more education, whatever it might be, that we get out of it. It's not by becoming, which is I think where the Hungaries and others are, is that they're trying to survive in the 21st century by becoming more authoritarian, by looking at places like China or the smaller city-states of Singapore and the UAE as like a model for how to govern their societies.
Can I come in now, Adrian? Hang on just a minute? Sure. There's another question in, which I'm coming towards the end. So there's a question in from Margaret Schuster, who asks, how easy is it? I'm just going on to something kind of local now. How easy is it to fiddle the results of elections, especially in the digital age?
There's different mechanisms for fiddling. So I'll just kick it off by saying, something that we keep getting back to.
I haven't got very long though. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Back to the media here, I think the key tactic that we see used is control over the media. Yeah. And, particularly when getting back to the local governance versus national governance, when so much of the media is focused on national conversations and where they're setting the agenda around the national conversation, and it actually gets people away from the real issues. And that's where it's essentially driven all independent media out of the country. If in India, using the cronies who are so close to the Modi government to then purchase the key vector of electoral manipulation. When it comes to actually, compromising electoral systems, that's a cybersecurity question. It's essentially the case that most systems are secure, but there's also a check on the systems, and so there's a backup, right? There's
Forgive me, Adrian. It's not just a cybersecurity question, because you can nobble elections in old-fashioned ways too.
Right.
You can introduce hurdles before people can register. We've just had photographic identity introduced in the UK. Before you can go and vote, and that's a significant obstacle to lots of people. There are all sorts of old-fashioned ways of nobbling elections, postal votes, voter ID, just queues that don't get processed, people lining up into the street, and then the guillotine comes down at 10 o'clock at night, and downright intimidation probably in some places as well.
It's possible to suppress voting, which is what Shami's talking about. It's possible to manipulate voters. Certainly, I agree with Adrian about that. But if in the United States, is Virginia's electoral count system going to be hacked and manipulated? Is Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping going to stuff our ballot boxes? No, but that's not the relevant question, right? I think both of you are correct to say voter suppression and voter manipulation are pressing and important, and more problematic probably than the mechanics of actually tallying the vote.
Yeah. William, do you want to say anything on this?
No, nothing new about electoral manipulation. I recall being told about a by-election during the Second World War in which, at a crucial point in the third recount, a collection of ballots was discovered to have been stuck underneath the duck boards during the counting process. The right to scrutinize elections is clearly extremely important, and the right to report on them through the media is also vital. And I note in some states in America arguments about who is going to be allowed in to watch the count taking place, and that's a very dangerous thing. In the United Kingdom and in most other mature democracies, members of the different parties are invited to watch the count just to make sure that it is free and fair and accurate.
Thank you. I'm going to start to bring it to a close now. Can I just say, Shami, as a professor of English, I absolutely agree with what you said. About the humanities? The decline of the humanities is a real danger for democracy and for our country. It's very, very pertinent at the present time. I want to finish really with something that's coming from one of our listeners, whose name's Roger, and he said Howard Taft, who was the American president from 1909 to 1913, spoke on the campaign trail in 1912 on the ability of the American people to see through what he called the misrepresentation and demagoguery which had been heard during the presidential campaign. Nothing's new, it appears. What a wonderful discussion, and a very important discussion. I think we'll get many hits on YouTube for this. Thank you all. I just asked Sandy if he wants to say anything before I actually bring it to a close.
Thank you too, Mike, and thanks to all our panelists. This is just exactly what we aspire to, and the more it runs away with important points, the better it is in a way. We're thankful to Georgetown University, of course, for continuing to support these dialogues. President Jack DeGioia and Vice President Tom Banchoff, and all our infrastructure, our colleague John McCabe, who runs these programs from month to month without any apparent stress or any difficulty. So we'll be back next month again, and we appreciate all of our audience joining us.
Well, thank you, Sandy, for chairing it. Thank you, Shami, William, Ronald, Adrian. A fascinating and very important discussion. The next free speech project at the Crossroads International Dialogues event, in association with the Future of the Humanities Project, will be on Wednesday, October the 23rd, when we will be discussing the neglected wars, the neglected crises, those wars that are going on at the moment that hardly get any notice because of everything else that's happening. The series Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, will return on Monday, the 21st of October, when Dr. Philip Booth from St Mary's University, Twickenham in England, will be discussing the welfare state that we're in, James Bartholomew's book, The Welfare States That We're in. My thanks also to our colleagues at Georgetown, particularly to Jack DeGioia, that many of you know is very unwell at the moment, and we wish him a speedy recovery. We miss him very much. And also to Tom Banchoff at Blackfriars, to John O'Connor, the Regent, to Dominic White, the new prior at Blackfriars Hall, and to Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute at Campion Hall, to Dr. Nick Austin. My thanks too to John McCabe and to Maggie Scott, who helps me in organising all of this from this end. Thank you, those of you who have asked questions and who have attended today. I'm Professor Mike Scott. I'm Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott or LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. I do not appear on X or whatever it is called. Until next time, take care, keep safe. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much to all.